In this video, we'll consider the at-risk limitation with respect to losses. Now, before we get into the specific Section 465 at-risk limitation rules, we first have to start by asking, do we have an actual loss? Now, a loss from a certain activity will allow for a possible deduction on the tax return. Ways that a loss can occur. It's not as simple as just, okay, I've sold some property, do I have a loss? That's what we normally think of when we have a sale or other disposition under Section 1001. So under Section 1001, sale or other dispositions of property can create a realized gain or loss. It's also possible to have a loss if your expenses or your deductions exceed your income with respect to a business activity. For example, if you only have $10,000 of income from your sole proprietorship for the year, but you have $15,000 in related deductions, you have a $5,000 loss. The question becomes, can the taxpayer actually deduct that loss, that $5,000 loss, on his or her return? So it's not simply just the Section 1001 sale or other disposition, it's also, we'll say, a net loss from an activity. So once you've established that there is a loss, the next element to consider is, are we limited with respect to the loss under the general and specific loss limitations with respect to deductions? The general and specific loss limits deal with the deductibility of losses. So once you go through those hurdles, you have a loss, you've gone through the general and specific loss limits, and the loss has not been limited, meaning it's still there. It's still impossible that it will be deducted on the tax return. The next stop is the Section 465 at-risk loss limits. So this is really what we're focusing on. We're focusing on the Section 465 at-risk loss limits in this video. Now, a little brief history. You might have heard the phrase tax shelters, and you're thinking, whoa, yeah, that's what people would do to avoid or evade taxes. Avoid being to do it legally or evade to do it illegally. And that's the general idea, is that tax shelters, they reduce taxes. And before 1986, before the Internal Revenue Code of 1986, there were certain loopholes in the Internal Revenue Code that allowed for ways that people with ordinary income that were taxed at very high rates could use tax shelters to lower their high tax rates as much as 70, 80, 90% down to lower rates. So that's really what these Section 465 at-risk loss limitations get at, along with the Section 469, which is another video. The idea is that, generally, you're allowed to take a loss, which again can be a net loss, or can be a Section 1001 sale or other disposition loss, to the extent that you are at risk with respect to the activity. That is the general idea. But you're wondering, okay, well, what exactly does that mean? That sounds very vague. And generally speaking, it is. So now we're considering the specific rules under Section 465 at risk. So again, we've gone through the general and specific loss limits. Now we're at Section 465, and we have to proceed under Section 465. So Section 465 only applies to specific activities. Now, the specific activities that apply deal with two of the big three. So the big three, you might recall, I mentioned this a lot with respect to the big three. Two of the big three. So business and investment activities are where Section 465 applies. Now, if you recall, personal activities, generally you can't take losses. You can't take losses with respect to personal activities. You see that this up here with respect to the general loss limits under Section 165. So this Section 465 applies to all business and all investment activities. That's important to understand. Which, if you've gotten this far, you probably are a business or investment activity. So it applies to both of those. Once you've established it's a business investment activity, then we have to proceed and say, okay, well, of the loss that we have, again, loss is defined broadly, we're allowed to deduct the amount that's considered at risk. At risk is the key. At risk, that's the key language. All right? The amount that is at risk. So what exactly is that? The amount at risk is referred to in Section 465 to be the sum of four things. The sum of four different things. Cash contributions by the taxpayer with respect to the activity, property contributions, the portion of recourse liabilities that the taxpayer is responsible for with respect to the activity, and finally the portion of non-recourse liabilities that the taxpayer is responsible for, but only to the extent of pledged other assets that the taxpayer has presented to the activity. So it's all reviewing this all with respect to the activity that's going on. Because these rules a lot of times apply to specific like partnerships and various types of entities, but just think of it generally as an activity, because you can be a sole proprietorship, a flow through onto your tax return. So this is with respect to the activity. The activity. Now, cash contributions, that's the amount the taxpayer actually is contributing to the activity or business or whatever it is. So if you have a loss, so one thing to consider is that in another video, there'll be a discussion regarding what is basis, which basis is the idea of it's like a tax capital. It's like kind of like recovery capital. It's a storehouse of unrecovered capital that's already been pre-taxed is a good way to think about it. At risk is a separate. So at risk and is not the same as basis. Just keep that in mind for later on when you learn about basis. So at risk versus adjusted basis, or we'll just say basis. We just say basis in the tax jargon. Very different concepts. You're going to have to keep two separate notions. Even though it's possible these amounts might be the same. It's possible, just so you know. Especially if you only have 1, 2, and 3. The cash contributions, the property contributions, and the recourse liabilities. So the cash contributions, again, that's what the taxpayer is contributing to the activity. Property contributions, so cash is just a face value. Property contributions, that's going to be the fair market value. The fair market value of the property that the taxpayer contributes to the actual activity. So fair market value is what we use, not the basis. Next is the portion of recourse liabilities the taxpayer is responsible for. So I want to talk to you about recourse versus non-recourse liabilities. And I'm going to do this over here next to this activity. It's very important to understand recourse versus non-recourse liabilities. Recourse liabilities are liabilities where the creditor-lender can go after the actual personal assets of the taxpayer that's responsible for the recourse liability. Versus non-recourse, that's not the case. Non-recourse, the creditor can only go after the amount that the taxpayer has invested in the business. It's kind of similar to the idea when you learn about limited liability versus unlimited liability with respect to business entities. Similar idea. Recourse, economic risk of loss that the taxpayer actually bears. Non-recourse, the taxpayer does not bear because the taxpayer is not personally liable. So it makes sense that the portion of recourse liabilities the taxpayer is responsible for, that's going to be included in the amount that's at risk. Okay, so we have cash contributions, property contributions, and then the portion of recourse liabilities that the taxpayer is responsible for, all are included in that. The non-recourse portion of liabilities are not included unless, so the general rule is that non-recourse liabilities are not included in the amount at risk, which in the basis concepts, you can learn in another topic that non-recourse liabilities, actually the portion that the taxpayer is allocated or considered part of, they're actually put in the basis of the taxpayer. And this is actually under the two Supreme Court cases, Crane and Tufts. Those are the name of the cases, Crane and Tufts. Long line of jurisprudence. Well, that's the general rule. Non-recourse liabilities are not considered at risk. But if a taxpayer has a portion of a non-recourse liability and that there's other assets that are pledged. So most non-recourse liabilities, there's some kind of asset that secures the liability. You're thinking, well, how can anybody borrow money from a lender, and how can they get away with not having some personal, skin in the game if they foreclose on the property? They don't actually pay off their things. Usually what happens is that there's security collateral. So that's the idea, is that if a taxpayer has pledged other assets with respect to his or her portion of the non-recourse liabilities, then the lender can go after those assets up to the amount pledged. So that amount is going to be considered part of the amount that's at risk, the portion that's at risk. So the idea here is, I just want to go through a simple example. And this will kind of get at what this rule was designed to prevent. And then the last step is I'm going to show you what happens whether the loss is greater than the amount at risk or the loss is less than or equal to the amount at risk. So let's just take a simple example. Let's say that a taxpayer is interested in starting a business that's going to rent out property. It's going to rent out an apartment building. So we have our apartment building here, right? It's got some windows. Maybe it's a duplex. Something small, you know, maybe somebody rents the top floor and someone rents the bottom floor. Something along those lines. Like there's two segregated areas of the house that that people live in. Well, the taxpayer, the way that the taxpayer, let's say, secures the property is by using a non-recourse liability. Using a non-recourse liability and cash. So the non-recourse liability amount, let's just say is, let's say it's $1 million. So $1 million, $1 million for the non-recourse liability, and cash in the amount of $100,000. So in total, there's $1,100,000, and the taxpayer is the only owner of this property. That's a sole proprietorship, let's say. So let's say after the first year, based on all the expenses and whatnot, the taxpayer has a $5,000 loss. And let's just say the loss is because of the depreciation deductions. So everything breaks even except for the depreciation deductions. You know, they go over, which just say there's a $5,000 loss, and that's a result of the depreciation among the other expenses exceeding. So let's just say it's really because of the depreciation deductions. So that's really what was happening, where this rule was designed to prevent, is that depreciation deductions were creating these losses. All right, depreciation. So we have this $5,000 depreciation deduction that's creating a loss. Everything else, let's say, just breaks even. Just accept the numbers for what they are. I know you probably can calculate the tax amount, but let's just say that, and this is another world, right? And this is a loss, and we go through all the steps. We go through, this is a loss. It's a net loss. It's deductible under the general rules because this is a business activity, let's say, because this person is actively involved. And then we get to the at-risk limitations. So the amount at risk with respect to the taxpayer is the cash contribution, the property contributions, the portion of recourse liabilities, and the portion of non-recourse liabilities that are pledged as other assets. So we have the cash contributions of $100,000. We don't have any property contributions. That would be the taxpayer actually contributes property, and we use fair market value. There's no recourse liabilities, but we do have a non-recourse liability. Now, let's assume the non-recourse liability, there's no assets pledged. All right, no assets are pledged by the taxpayer. I know it sounds very unrealistic, but just bear with the example. So the taxpayer has an at-risk amount of $100,000, the amount of cash. And their $5,000 loss, that's going to be great. The loss is going to be less. So the loss is less than the at-risk AR amount for the year. And when it's at risk, when the loss is less than or equal to the amount at risk, it can be deducted for the year. It can be deducted. It can be deducted under the Section 465. So it's good for Section 465, but one thing I have to mention is that there's other loss limitations, such as the passive activity rules, that we still have to consider. So this is just Section 465. You also have to consider Section 469 passive, as well as there's capital loss limitations, and then usually once you get past the capital loss limitations, that if it survives, then you can deduct it on the tax return. So it's good if the loss is less than the amount at risk, then for Section 465 purposes, it's good. It can be deducted in the current year. This will also reduce the amount at risk because the amount at risk is calculated on a continuous basis. You keep track of it. So this reduces the amount at risk. What would happen if I changed around the facts and I told you that this actually created, let's say, same facts, non-recourse liability, cash of $100,000, same amounts, but let's say it's created a $120,000 loss. So this is, let's say, situation 1, In situation 2, let's say it's a $120,000 loss. If the loss is greater than the amount at risk is $100,000, right? We went through that. If the loss is greater than the amount at risk, then you can deduct for section 465, the portion of the amount at risk, of the at-risk amount. Now, remember, the at-risk amount is going to decrease, just like we saw here, to 0. It's going to go down to 0. So the at-risk amount goes to 0. It's possible that in the future, the taxpayer can increase the at-risk amount by contributing more cash, contributing property, all these things, just so you know. But the at-risk will reduce to $0. And the suspended loss, so here in our example, $20,000 is suspended, cannot be taken. It stops here, okay? That loss is suspended, and the suspended loss will be considered in future years going through the same tests. So if there's a cash contribution or property contribution or more recourse or non-recourse liabilities in the future, then that $20,000 suspended loss might be allowed to be taken in a future year if the at-risk amount goes up and allows for it. So again, if Section 465 is met, that's what we have here, you then have to consider other loss limitations. So you basically go down the checklist to the next loss limitations. So more loss limits are considered, and I'm going to talk about those in other videos. And that concludes our discussion of Section 465.